We're joined by a guest we've talked with previously on our program. Stefano is joining us on our program. He's co-director, producer of The Day I Had to Grow Up, and he's recently back from the Cannes Film Festival in France. As a matter of fact, I believe he spent a couple of months there. We'll talk with him about what that experience was like as well. And we had talked about The Day I Had to Grow Up on this program previously, but with this spate of mass shootings taking place in this country um, in recent days, weeks, months, even since the start of this year, it makes our discussion always a timely one. First of all, it's nice to have you again on our program.
Thank you, Bob, for having me back. It's nice to talk with you again and to be with you and having a good conversation like always.
What was Cannes like? You had never been there before.
I had been there one other time in 28
okay.
Yeah, in 2018, but this time it was great to be at a film festival where people desired to come back into a community of filmmakers, agents, buyers, salespeople, and be in person. This was really the first full film festival that I had been to since the pandemic. And there was a magic in the air of wanting to see movies in person and be with people. And I love the Cannes Film Festival because you get to see European films and Asian films, films from North Africa, South Africa, eastern parts of the world, Ukraine. There was a Ukrainian film I saw. So there's a full diversity of points of view, of perspectives that you don't get in America. You don't get in American cinemas. And that was the best thing after being in the States for so long, that I really enjoyed the perspective, the different world perspectives of filmmakers around the world.
What's it like to interact with these filmmakers from such a variety of backgrounds and regions?
I think that it's a little bit like when you first meet people and you're young as kids. You kind of, or like the metaphor would be like dogs smelling each other. You don't know what the other person is going to be like. You don't know if they're going to like you, or you don't know what sort of baggage that they have. But most of the time it's very beneficial. You guys can share on common values and what you believe. If you're there at Cannes, if you're a director primarily, you believe that cinema has a level of truth and can bring out a level of empathy, that cinema allows people to step into someone else's shoes as the audience, and you're creating those shoes, you're creating the environment for someone to do that. And I think that's what it's like. And also finding out they're very curious about America. They're very curious. I get a lot of very pointed questions about the country. And when Donald Trump was president, that was obviously a big topic. And school shootings, I was there when the Texas shooting happened in Uvalde, Texas. And so I got a lot of questions about gun violence there. And so you try to be an ambassador, I think, for your country when you're away, and you try to remain more objective. And then you also try to explain certain cultural values about America and to other people. And in that process, you start to notice objectively things that are wonderful about the country and things that are maybe not so wonderful about the country.
Okay. And how long a period of time was it that you were in France?
Oh, I would say, close to 2 months.
Okay. That's a nice break.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Really, really nice.
All right. Now, there are people listening to our discussion who, believe it or not, may not be familiar with The Day I Had to Grow Up. They may not have even heard us speak previously. In your own words, How do you describe
I describe it as a film that is a call to action. It follows 6 youth activists across America, and each youth activist represents a single specific issue. We have a survivor from the Parkland school shooting. We have 2 individuals who are heavily involved in the Sunrise Movement, so climate change aspects and everything having to do with the environmental protection and climate change. We have an individual who is very much into the focused on making changes in Pennsylvania about the redistricting and gerrymandering, and how census bureaus are built and factor into to swaying elections. We have another individual who's heavily involved in the student debt crisis, and another girl who is involved in the Black Lives Matter protests. And all these kids, all these individuals, there's nobody who's older the age of 18, and there's a real sense of trying to understand youth movements in America, why this generation is so active in activism, and following a little bit of their life about what they're like as kids and how they grew up.
now the motivation for the documentary in the first place? What what was that? And then the other aspect of this is, from the standpoint of people who didn't hear us talk previously, what was it like connecting with these young people?
The motivation, the first motivation was in February of 2018. I remember the Parkland school shooting, and I remember it was on Valentine's Day. I remember thinking to myself, this was a very different era than myself as a millennial of of growing up. I thought I couldn't imagine putting myself in the place in the shoes of these kids. And so I was very much drawn to the trauma that survivors would feel, and then how it affects their lives, and what they do with that trauma. What do you do? I mean, we all suffer traumas in our lives. How do you change or convert that into something positive and something constructive in your life? So I began to seek out activists who had experienced these types of traumas, and I came about 6 youth activists. One of them was Taylor Nicole Turner, and another one was Jeremy Ornstein, who I found so compelling. Um, he was the second person that I found out, and he was he was doing something very bold. He was attacking the Democratic Party for not doing enough on climate change reforms, and he was outside of Nancy Pelosi's office. And I found, and the personal story that he was relating to his grandparents who had survived the Holocaust, and he was talking about sort of that the embarrassment that he felt, that kids were the ones who were saying they didn't feel safe. Kids were the ones that were telling the adults that they needed to be protected better, uh, and that the adults in the room weren't doing their job. And that, I remember watching that, and I usually try to watch things very critically, but I remember being very emotional, and I remember all the sort of analytical parts of my brain just sort of flying out. And I just remember sitting there, seeing how genuine that was. And he was president of the Young Democrats of America at the time, High School Democrats of America. So I just became compelled with these kids' lives. How do they end up in these positions? Why do they want to become activists? Uh, all these sort of questions that were rolling in my mind.
Hmm. And as we're talking, and I said in introducing you, there's been this massive spate of shootings taking place in this country. One weekend, um, earlier this month, there were, I believe, 26 mass shootings, which is involved 3 or more people, as I understand, that took place across the country. And you think of this sort of thing occurring, and a lot of people seem now to be kind of waking up to exactly what's taking place here, and kind of on high alert, and looking for answers, basically, which is only natural. So I'm not surprised that you got questions about this when you were in France as well. But one of the things that seems to be coming up an awful lot in discussions and questions being posed, even by people talking with one another, goes to the idea with these school shootings of what effect this really can have and is having when we look at this from a long term on the children who actually survive a shooting. I mean, this
Yeah.
details of this of Parkland, the details of Uvalde in terms of what took place are horrifying enough. But for these young people who lived through this, um, obviously, it's the understatement of the year to say this is going to be with them the rest of their lives.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It never goes away. It never goes away. And if we want to get really specific, um, we talk about children exhibiting parallel symptoms to ones that our veterans experience when they come back from Iraq.
Right.
And that's staggering because you have people that are enrolled and enlisted in the military. They know some of the consequences that they're going to experience, and they're adults, they're of age. These are children that are experiencing these. They're far less capable and far more susceptible to many of these traumas. So let's go through them. Fear of public spaces.
Right.
A massive fear of public spaces, trauma, breaking down, not wanting to go into public spaces, less trust, sort of in general, in trust with strangers, trust with individuals within their lives. It affects those friendships and partnerships that they have. The third thing I would say is that because they're children, they haven't had the chance to develop their verbal communication. And so getting them to talk about this pain and the trauma is hard. They're not fully formed. And so the challenges for them to share is also very hard. And so that affects them. They're often, it's like some of the children don't have the ability, don't feel ready yet how to share, and so they internalize a lot of these things. There's a fourth thing that I would bring up is victims, survivors' guilt. Many of them exhibit these symptoms of, why did I survive and other people, my classmates, why were they killed? These things that we know from Sandy Hook, from the kids from Sandy Hook, which I believe was in 2013, we know has lasted with them, and they're still seeking counseling. The question is, how much do we care on a congressional level to change this, to change our laws so that it doesn't happen again? The second is, how are we dedicating resources so that these individuals have a chance to seek out and live their own lives after such a trauma, so that that we don't see them as being broken forever. And that's important with victims. They often don't want to be seen as victims forever. It's a theme in the documentary, my film, The Day I Had to Grow Up. not being broken forever once you survive Parkland, once you survive a school shooting. How do you turn that into something positive in your life? And that's the ultimate goal, right? And the ones who hit that sort of highest level of self-actualization, they're able to somehow permutate and translate that trauma into something positive, into their community, and has value into their life. And I just want to highlight that March for Our Lives, they're an incredible organization that came out of Parkland. They're very featured prominently in our documentary, The Day I Had to Grow Up, and they're going to have many marches across the nation, including obviously the nation's capital, from the White House throughout the month of June. And so I'm so proud of March for Our Lives and what they've done to provide resources for victims of gun violence.
We're talking on our program with the gentleman we've spoken with previously, and I had a good discussion with him about some of the material that is contained in The Day I Had to Grow Up, which is a companion website, The Day Documentary, that's all is one word.com. It's the most interesting documentary. He's co-director, producer of The Day I Had to Grow Up. He is recently back from the Cannes Film Festival in France. Stefano Defray talking with us on our program. I'm Bob Salter. As I'm listening to you speak with us and thinking about some of the things you're sharing in this discussion, too, one of the issues that has come up very much in this discussion, or in discussions in the aftermath of the Uvalde, Texas shooting took place, is the irony, in a way, of this same gun or same type of gun being used in so many shootings. And you look at Sandy Hook, you look at Parkland, you look at the shooting at the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde. You got the same gun being used there. I mean,
yeah.
What is that really saying? And the other aspect of this that comes up in discussion naturally is, ideally, really, what can be done about that?
So I'm glad you brought this up. I'm looking out into into the sky as I'm listening to you into this, and I'm thinking about the impact that the AR-15 has had. Why has it been a choice? And I think one of the aspects of it has been it's so easily accessible. And so for example, in Texas, we know that the suspect was able to have it a few days after his 18th-year-old birthday. It's a gun of choice for school shooters because it can kill multiple people, have multiple rounds in a magazine. It's a semi-automatic, and it's an assault rifle. And the accessibility for it is very, very easy. It speaks to a greater problem to us of why do we need individuals that have semi-automatic weapons? Why do we need military assault rifles? And why is this such a challenge to congressional leaders in this country? The AR-15 was not envisioned in the Second Amendment. When our forefathers thought about the Second Amendment, they thought that about bearing arms against a militia, but they were using black powder or muzzle loaders. And these muzzle loaders took very, very long to load. No one could have known the advances of technology now that we're resting back on the laurels of the Second Amendment. So some of this is a cognitive dissonance. We have sort of a cultural problem moving past the idea of the Second Amendment and the ability to allow all guns at all times, even military assault rifles, for individuals who are not in the military. The second thing is the age. You know, you can't be, it doesn't make sense that you only are able to have a beer at the age of 21, but you can have a military assault rifle a couple days after you turn 18 with no questions asked. There are some, that's a cultural problem. And that's a problem that can be fixed in this country by addressing age limits, addressing red flag laws, uh, addressing why we are selling these weapons and what's available to the general public. All of these issues are ones that contribute to mass shootings. It's not just one thing. It's a list of things. And just coming back to that weapon, it's been in every, I mean, you mentioned it, right? I mean, it's been in Sandy Hook. It was the same gun used in Parkland, same gun used in Uvalde, Texas shooting. I believe it was also the same one in Colorado at the theater. So we know that a certain type of individual, usually male, usually feeling wanting to get revenge, wanting to feel bigger than, not feeling part of a community, and sort of a sense of sort of getting retribution for the emotional pain that they're suffering through, are gravitating towards these guns. They also have message boards. There's a whole aspect to this of our policing of message boards, of them doing a lot of research and finding out that these are guns that can take out a specific amount of people in a very quick amount of time. So we have to be prepared to sort of dig into the dark aspects of our culture, of why these things are happening, why, and the availability of them. Certainly making it accessible in the way that we have created this situation, and other countries don't have it. You don't see this in Canada. You don't see this in France, where I just was. You don't see it in Germany. You don't see it in any other Western country. So we know it's our problem. We know we have to own it. We own this problem. And the lobbyists, when it comes to the National Rifle Association, I think it's sad, because many Republicans, and the reason I choose out the Republicans is because we think of Republicans as being very pro Second Amendment. But we know from polling that many Republicans, a majority of Republicans, are against having access to an AR-15 at least until the age of 21. So it shows there's a disconnect even within the Republican Party of a lobbying aspect from the NRA to having enough power to just not be able to have enough changes where you're changing age limits at the very minimum, and at the very best, getting rid of an assault rifle for civilians.
A natural question is also going back to this idea of when you were in France, obviously was when you learned about this shooting in Uvalde. What was the coverage of that like?
It was pretty strong. It was second story, or some even leading story the day of in Paris and in Nice, in the newspaper of Nice Matin, which would be the biggest newspaper that I was in near Cannes. The coverage from a European's perspective is, there's something wrong with America. There's something wrong that we haven't. It's almost like they're asking the question in their coverage, and I don't think they mean to editorialize it, but they're asking the question: how many more shootings does this country need to have to do practical changes in their gun laws. How many more? And sort of they have these round table debates of, getting access and whether the police were right, or that's also the other difference in the American coverage. If I can just go back, Bob, in the American coverage on MSNBC, CNN, CNBC, Fox, they'll cover what the police did, what they knew, and how long it took them to go inside, which is extremely important to knowing the response time, and to the people who acted bravely and to the ones who were reluctant to go inside. That's one aspect that is extremely relevant. But the Europeans don't spend that much time on this issue. What they spend time on is the greater philosophical issue of how many more shootings America needs to have for them to change the gun laws. And also, how did the NRA become so influential to gridlock policy, to create congressional gridlock? That's how the European covers, the European coverage is, and how the coverage was in France on the big stations that were in Paris, Canal Plus, newspapers of Nice Matin, Arte, which is another television station. They're fascinated, really fascinated by how this lobby group has been able to gridlock, against basically, we've had now over a decade. If you go back to Columbine, Columbine, I think, is 98, I don't know, 99. That's 24 years that the red light's been on. And that's the way the Europeans cover it. We cover it more with, well, maybe we'll do school safety laws, school safety drills. What did the police know? How long did they come in? But we should be asking the bigger question, the philosophical questions. And that's how you're going to unlock the congressional gridlock. That's how you're going to make it move forward, where you just say, no, we don't accept this anymore in our country. It's unacceptable. This is totally unacceptable.
And we hear a lot of talk about red flag laws. What do you think of that idea? And then the natural companion question currently is, realistically, would that be helpful in preventing school shootings?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you brought this up. Red flag laws, I think, are first of all, let's just, for your listeners, they're risk-based gun removal laws. So it's basically an extreme risk protection order that a family member, a spouse, someone can petition, and if there is the case that someone is potentially going to commit a crime with a gun, that you can get a very, very quick response to having their gun temporarily, and the word temporarily is very important, because it allows a period of cooling off from the person to have their firearm privileges taken away. This is petitioned by a family member, could be a parent, a brother, and a spouse. We've seen that these have happened. They've been very beneficial in Florida. And you would think as Florida being extremely pro-gun friendly, but after Parkland, these red flag laws have been used, we know statistically, many, many times, for individuals who may have purchased the gun. Let's say, for example, Bob, you and I have a very close friend, and this person has had his gun for 5 years and starts to have be diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Then over time starts talking about, committing a crime. You can have that person petition to have their gun being temporarily taken away as a family member in case of, and a judge makes that decision, right? We know that they're effective. We know that they've prevented crimes. You only have them in 8 states: Colorado, California, Connecticut, Florida, Indiana, Maryland, New York, Oregon, and Vermont. 9 of them. This should be a federal thing. I mean, it's very, very preventative and very beneficial. In the case of Florida, a place that is Ron DeSantis is governor, very pro this issue, right? You know that something has cultural balance when you have Republicans and Democrats rarely agreeing on the same thing, but showing that they're in favor of something. And so in these states, like Vermont, like Indiana, you have a lot of Republicans that have seen the effects of the red flag laws be beneficial to preventing shootings and mass shootings. So that's really the important aspect of that. It should be in all 50 states. And there's a lot of names for it. Extreme risk firearm protection. You can call it procedures for seizure and retention of a firearm. But the ultimate reality is that the one disadvantage about them is that you need to have a family member or someone who cares about that person, obviously, right? So if you're living in isolation, red flag laws are not exactly effective, but hopefully, you're living in a community and you have siblings, parents, a spouse, and you're trusting them and the judge to make a decision to have you temporarily remove that under extreme risk. They're not perfect laws, but they're better than what we've had. And we see that cases that have had shootings, like in Colorado, like in Florida, really start to take them more seriously and enact them. But again, they're only in 9 states. And that's what I would say. I think that they're extremely beneficial. And, don't trust Democrats about it or people from March for Our Lives. Ask the Republicans in those states. Ask them. They'll tell you. They'll be the first ones to tell you that the benefits for them.
We're talking on a program with Stefano DeFrey, who is co-director, producer of The Day I Had to Grow Up, which is on the web by the web. The companion website is The Day Documentary. That's all is one word.com. He's recently back from the Cannes Film Festival in France, and he is talking with us on our program. I'm Bob Salter. In the information you're sharing, and obviously talking about, all the talk surrounding these shootings, especially the school shootings. The other question that comes up is usually follows the discussion about the red flag laws is what can schools do to actually, I guess, step this up a bit in terms of protecting themselves better and the people who are working and learning inside those schools?
First thing I would say that schools can do to be better prepared is to have an evacuation process that you guys take seriously. Have an evacuation plan. Be able to have a drill, a school shooting drill that you guys run once a month, once every 6 weeks, so that there are clear measures in place when that happens so that you're able to effectively do that. Another one that would take some resources is to have an alarm, a silent alarm inside the classroom. So you notify immediately when something is going wrong in that classroom. That's a second thing that we can do. The third thing is also going on to the first issue, just borrowing from that first of safety drills, having double locked doors. We know that in the Texas school shooting, he was able to enter in the back door that should have been locked. it is heartbreaking and almost unimaginable to think what would happen if that door had been locked. We don't know, and we're never going to really know what could have happened. But we know that if we take the security of those schools much more seriously and are much more diligent about that, we we lower the probability of it happening or making it much harder for that person to access the premise. Those would be the three things that I would say. Now, school, the drills, the silent alarms of those emergency alarms that are in the classrooms, running your proper school drills, having a school shooting drill that everyone has an evacuation plan, a proper procedure and process. And the third is looking at aspects of how the classroom or the school is secured for back doors, back latches. The fourth, and the fourth is a questionable one, and I'll bring this up just sort of lightly, is when you have a security guard there, make sure the security guard is really alert and really doing their job. We know that the security guards in the past of past school shootings in the past 10 years have not been very effective in terms of when a real shooter comes in. And we can assess that to the human element, right? People want the job, but when you have to put yourself on the line, there's an understanding element where the person says, I'm not capable to do this, and I have no idea and I'm not prepared enough. And so that leads us into law enforcement being prepared and security people who get those jobs to being prepared to face school shootings in a variety of scenarios. The training has to be better in our schools. It sounds dire in that sense, but we have to train security individuals for the schools to be specific around what they can face. And we know that these are things that have happened many times around our country. So it's the number one thing. The training has to be better as a security guard and for police to handling the situations. Those are the four things that I would strongly suggest.
And the power of the active shooter drills, can that be understated?
The power of the act, the reality is when there's so much variables when a school shooter comes in. Every one of them have been very different. But the drills are often they're often looking for ways to get out of the school as quickly as possible, and making sure that you're able to exit the school as quickly as possible. And then once someone is inside, if that case were to happen, having silent alarms that are able to notify so that they're able to come in and apprehend the suspect as quickly as possible. It's a race against time. All these cases took place over a specific amount of time that they were able to lock themselves into these classrooms. We know that the longer period of time that they're in these classrooms, the more victims, the more deaths that result in that. So in the case of Texas, we know that the person was in there over a 45-minute period. And so that period of time is unimaginable. So part of it is extremely trying to have individuals get out of that space as quickly as possible and lowering the time that a school shooter is inside the building to prevent a bad situation getting even worse.
I'm curious your reaction to the news that I guess it was the local school board in Uvalde announced after the shooting had taken place, or in the days afterward. They met, and the announcement was made that Robb Elementary School would be closed. Your reaction to that, and why was that important?
I think it was a community decision. I think that they did it because of the trauma of the kids coming back. Um, it was not a, Uvalde is not a very big town in Texas. And there were two reasons why it was done. The first is the parents are in shock, the ones who have survived, um, and don't want to send don't have have a legitimate safety risk, and they feel that. The second one is the trauma aspect. And this goes back to talking about the documentary, my documentary, The Day I Had to Grow Up, and a survivor from the Parkland school shooting, and them dealing with the trauma in their lives. Those parents and the school board that canceled school at Robb Elementary wanted them to not face that trauma right away, that there was a period of time that should pass. And that's extremely important. I support it 100%. I think that it's a very natural reaction for a parent to have kids who have made it out and are holding their kids tighter, thinking twice about sending off their kids. They can't just resume life back up to normal. It stays in the community. And it's another thing that, I'm glad also you asked me this, because it touches on a point that I hadn't brought up earlier. The consequences of a school shooting stays in the community with the survivors also for a prolonged period of time. And that's one of the reasons why you keep those schools closed for a period of parents to recover and the children who have experienced that to recover. That was the decision of the school board. And I it's not going to be closed, obviously, forever, but we're already in the month of June now. School's going to be finished. I think a period of time until they come back and resume in the fall is very, very, very reasonable.
Couple of thoughts that I always imagine can be in the minds of people listening to us. I didn't ask you this one earlier. I think we talked about this the last time that we spoke, but I'll pose the question now. That title of The Day I Had to Grow Up. Some people will think, why did you choose that title?
It's a great question. And it's a question, very simply put, I remember 9/11. My generation, I was as a millennial, I knew that I wasn't a kid anymore. When I saw the second tower go in, living in New York, experiencing the aftermath of it, I just grew up. There's an innocence that breaks. You never get it back. You never, never, never get that innocence back. And similarly, I thought of the title when those kids, any survivor of a school shooting, you never get that innocence back. That's the day that you had to grow up. And I just found it very appropriate, very simple, very authentic. And it hits you home. It hits you in your chest. It hits you right where it should hit you. That there's a moment in your life where the innocence is kind of taken away from you. And in the documentary, you see all these kids in their describing their childhood of specific moments that led them to lose that innocence, and then eventually leads them to become activists. And the point of the film is not that you lose the innocence and that you're broken forever, but that you lose the innocence and you try to turn it into something positive for your local community, your state, and hopefully for the United States of America, for this country, to make it a better country.
In that role of interviewing young people whose lives were so drastically impacted. Um, the ones that are featured in The Day I Had to Grow Up. Interviewing them, what effect did that have on you?
Oh, Bob, I think it had well, certainly had a very personal attachment to the young kids, to the activists. Um, so the first thing I would say is that the personal attachment to them was strong.
Mm.
Um, the second thing is that it made me reconsider some of the idealisms that I'd given up as an adult to try to think about the world in a very practical way. And that there were certain things, certain values, certain inherent values that one should not give up. That in the course of us discussing, for example, the power and the lobbying power of the NRA, there is a, a natural adult perspective to understand the political process, which is good because we need to compromise and understand how to keep this country going forward. But there also is another component to the human experience, which is that you also give up sometimes your idealisms. And there are certain things, certain idealisms that are healthy to remain in your life as an adult. It made me reconnect with those idealisms and to say, enough is enough. And this is not acceptable. School shootings are never acceptable. They're, it's not enough. And that part of activism is very healthy. It's a part of, and it's often, it's seen with youth because youth come at the intersection between criticality and hope. They see the world's pain, but they also see the world's possibility. And it's important as adults to have that perspective as well, that youth perspective, so we know how to navigate the adult world, which we're already more comfortable with in a pragmatic way. That's how it affected me. Gave me back a little bit of that innocence, a little bit more of that integrity to values and idealism that I had sort of lost over time.
Brilliant discussion, Stefano DeFrey, co-director, producer of The Day I Had to Grow Up, companion website, The Day Documentary, that's all at one word.com. Thank you very much for your time, your kind words, and for joining us on our program.
Thank you for having me, Bob.
And certainly the best continued with your work. And congratulations on the accomplishments with this documentary. And welcome back from your
Thank
trip.
you. I'm always glad to be with you. I love the conversations we have. They're thinking conversations. And it means a lot to be back on your show.
And one final question for you. What's in the works project-wise?
I'm working on the biggest patent lawsuit in history, $1 billion lawsuit against an Italian inventor who invented stuffed crust pizza that was stolen from him by the Pizza Hut Corporation. The title of the documentary is Stolen Dough. We go through the patent process, and it's very much a David and Goliath story of individuals who have only a certain amount of money and can't fight to protect their patent, and big corporations come in and have a multitude of lawyers, and sort of understanding the process of patent protections in America and also looking at corporations, how common this is for corporations to take advantage of inventors, people who come up with products, and it's showing it also as a systemic problem. And of course, the human element of how do you recover from that trauma? What has that person done with his life, his or her life, after they've battled a big corporation? So I always try to cover the human element, obviously, and the recovery period of things like that. Yeah, that's the documentary Stolen Dough. It'll be a feature film.
Very much look forward to it. Thank you. Continued good health and good progress with your work.
Thank you, Bob.